On December 4th, 1872, the British ship Dei Gratia was sailing through the Atlantic Ocean, about 400 miles east of the Azores Islands, when the crew spotted something unusual on the horizon. Another ship, drifting erratically, its sails torn and flapping in the wind. As they drew closer, Captain David Morehouse recognized the vessel. It was the Mary Celeste, an American merchant brigantine that had left New York Harbor just 8 days before the Dei Gratia. Morehouse knew the Mary Celeste's captain personally. They were friends. They'd had dinner together in New York before both ships departed. But something was wrong. The Mary Celeste was moving strangely, listing slightly to one side, with no one at the helm. No crew visible on deck. No response to their hailing calls. Captain Morehouse sent a boarding party across. What they found when they climbed aboard would become one of the greatest maritime mysteries of all time. The ship was completely abandoned. No crew, no passengers, no bodies, no signs of struggle. The cargo was intact. There was food on the table. The crew's personal belongings were still in their quarters. The last entry in the ship's log was dated 10 days earlier, November 25th, and gave no indication of any problems. 10 people had simply vanished from a seaworthy ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The Mary Celeste was found sailing herself, a ghost ship with no one aboard. And to this day, 152 years later, we still don't know what happened to them. The Mary Celeste wasn't some mysterious vessel that appeared out of nowhere. She had a documented history, a registered crew, and a legitimate cargo manifest. Understanding what the ship was and who was aboard makes the mystery even more baffling. The Mary Celeste was a merchant brigantine, a two-masted sailing ship designed for cargo transport. She was 103 feet long, about 282 tons, and had been built in Nova Scotia, Canada, in 1861. Originally named the Amazon, the ship had an unfortunate history of accidents and ownership changes before being purchased, rebuilt, and renamed Mary Celeste in 1868. By 1872, the ship was owned by a consortium of investors. But the primary owner and captain was a man named Benjamin Spooner Briggs. And this is important. Captain Briggs was not some inexperienced sailor or reckless adventurer. He was 37 years old, deeply religious, and came from a seafaring family. His father was a sea captain. His brothers were sea captains. He himself had commanded several vessels and completed numerous successful voyages across the Atlantic. Friends and business associates described him as competent, careful, and level-headed. This was not a man prone to panic or poor judgment. On November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste departed New York Harbor with a cargo of 1,701 barrels of commercial alcohol, specifically denatured alcohol intended for fortifying wine in Italy. The cargo was valuable, but not particularly dangerous if properly stored and sealed. The crew consisted of 7 men, carefully selected by Captain Briggs himself. There was Albert Richardson, the first mate, age 28, experienced and reliable. Andrew Gilling, the second mate, a Dane in his mid-20s, and 4 experienced sailors, the Lorenzen brothers from Germany, Gottlieb Gondeschall and Boz Lorenzen. These weren't desperate men or troublemakers. They were professional sailors hired for a routine commercial voyage. But Captain Briggs made a decision that was both unusual and touching. He brought his family with him. His wife, Sarah, age 30, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia Matilda. Sarah had sailed with her husband before. She was the daughter of a minister and a proper Victorian woman. but she wasn't afraid of the sea. In letters home, she wrote about life aboard ship with enthusiasm and detail. Their daughter, Sophia, little Sophia, just 2 years old, this would be her second voyage. They'd left their 7-year-old son, Arthur, at home with relatives to continue his schooling. So here's what we know for certain. On November 7th, 1872, the Mary Celeste left New York with 10 people aboard, an experienced captain, his wife and young daughter, 7 capable sailors, a cargo of alcohol. Destination: Genoa, Italy. An absolutely routine Atlantic crossing that should have taken about a month. For the first 3 weeks, everything seemed normal. The Mary Celeste's voyage started without incident. The ship departed New York on November 7th, and for those first several weeks, everything aboard appears to have been completely normal. We know this because of the ship's log, a detailed record that Captain Briggs meticulously maintained. The weather in early November was fair. The ship made good progress. In letters Sarah Briggs had written before departure, she expressed excitement about the journey and confidence in her husband's abilities. There's no indication of any concerns about the crew, the cargo, or the ship's condition. The Dei Gratia, the ship that would eventually discover the Mary Celeste, left New York 8 days after the Mary Celeste, on November 15th. Captain David Morehouse, who commanded the Dei Gratia, had indeed dined with Captain Briggs before both vessels departed. They discussed their routes. Both ships were heading generally eastward across the Atlantic, though to different destinations. As November progressed, the weather patterns in the Atlantic worsened, as they typically do that time of year. Captain Briggs noted in his log that they encountered some rough seas and strong winds, but nothing unusual for an Atlantic crossing in late autumn. These were conditions any experienced captain would expect and know how to handle. The last entry in the Mary Celeste's log is dated November 25th, 1872. The ship's position was noted as being near Santa Maria Island in the Azores. The entry is routine, noting weather conditions, position, and heading. There's no indication of trouble, no distress, no mention of any problems with the crew, the cargo, or the ship. It's just a normal log entry from a ship that was, by all appearances, having a normal voyage. And then, nothing. No more entries, no explanation, just silence. For the next 10 days, something happened aboard the Mary Celeste. Something that caused 10 people to abandon a seaworthy ship and vanish into the Atlantic Ocean. But what? December 4th, 1872. The Dei Gratia was about 400 miles east of the Azores, making steady progress on its own Atlantic crossing. It was early afternoon when one of the crew members noticed a ship on the horizon, several miles off their starboard bow. As they watched, it became clear that something was wrong with the vessel. It was moving erratically, yawing from side to side with its sails in disarray, some torn, some missing entirely. The ship appeared to be drifting rather than sailing purposefully. Captain Morehouse studied it through his spyglass, and then he recognized it. The Mary Celeste. Morehouse was immediately concerned. He'd left New York 8 days after Briggs. The Mary Celeste should have been well ahead of them by now, probably already approaching Gibraltar. Why was it here, seemingly adrift? He tried signaling the ship. No response. He changed course to intercept. As the Dei Gratia drew alongside the Mary Celeste, the situation became even more bizarre. There was no one on deck, no one at the helm. The ship's wheel was spinning freely. The main hatch was open. Several sails were torn or missing. But the ship itself seemed intact and wasn't taking on water. Morehouse hailed the ship repeatedly. Silence. This is where many sailors would have simply continued on their way. An abandoned ship could be a trap. Pirates were still a real concern in some waters, and there were maritime laws about salvage that could get complicated. But Morehouse and Briggs were friends. Morehouse was genuinely worried. He ordered his first mate, Oliver DeVoe, to take a small boarding party across to investigate. Oliver DeVoe and 2 other men rowed across to the Mary Celeste. They climbed aboard cautiously, not knowing what they might find. Pirates? Plague victims? A booby trap? What they found was far stranger than any of those possibilities. The ship was deserted, completely, utterly abandoned. No crew, no passengers, no bodies, no blood, no signs of violence or struggle. But here's what made it so eerie. The ship was in good condition. Yes, some sails were torn, probably from being abandoned and drifting for days. But the hull was sound. The pumps were working. There was only about 3 feet of water in the hold, which was normal for a ship of that era. The cargo of alcohol barrels was intact, properly stored, and still sealed. 9 of the barrels were found empty later, but this was attributed to natural leakage, not unusual for wooden barrels on a sea voyage. Below deck, the scene was like a ship frozen in time. In the crew's quarters, personal belongings were still there. Clothing, pipes, books. In the captain's cabin, Sarah Briggs's sewing materials were neatly arranged. A small toy, possibly little Sophia's, was found in the cabin. The ship's chronometer and sextant were missing, along with the ship's papers and navigation log, but these are instruments that would be taken if abandoning ship. The ship's register, the official document proving ownership, was still aboard. Most eerily, in the galley, there was evidence of a meal being prepared. Food was in the stove. Dishes were set out. It was as if everyone had simply stood up and walked off the ship mid-task. The ship's compass was destroyed, smashed, with no clear explanation. The ship's clock had stopped. And most significantly, the ship's only lifeboat was gone. The ropes that had secured it were still attached to the davits, but they'd been cut or torn away, not properly lowered. This suggested a hasty, possibly panicked departure. Oliver DeVoe searched the entire ship. Every cabin, every storage area, every possible place someone could be hiding or trapped. Nothing. 10 people had vanished. He returned to the Dei Gratia and reported to Captain Morehouse. The Mary Celeste was seaworthy but abandoned. No crew, no passengers, no bodies. No clear indication of what had happened. The ship had been sailing itself, a ghost ship adrift in the Atlantic. Captain Morehouse faced a difficult decision. He could let the Mary Celeste continue drifting, but it was a hazard to navigation, and he had a duty to prevent that. Or he could claim salvage rights and bring the ship into port. But that meant splitting his own crew. Some would have to sail the Mary Celeste while the rest continued on the Dei Gratia. It would be risky and difficult. Morehouse decided to take the ship. He assigned Oliver DeVoe and 2 other men to sail the Mary Celeste. For 9 days, the 2 ships sailed together toward Gibraltar. It must have been an eerie experience for those 3 men aboard the Mary Celeste, sailing a ghost ship that had carried 10 people just days earlier. On December 13th, both ships arrived in Gibraltar, and that's when the mystery became an international incident. When the Mary Celeste arrived in Gibraltar, flying both the American and British flags, a signal that it was under salvage, the authorities immediately launched an investigation. This wasn't just about a missing crew. There were serious legal and financial questions at stake. First, there was the salvage claim. Captain Morehouse and the crew of the DI Gratia were claiming salvage rights to the Mary Celeste and its cargo, which was worth a substantial amount of money. But was this a legitimate rescue, or something more sinister? Could Morehouse and his crew have been involved in foul play? After all, they just happened to find the ship of a man Morehouse knew personally. The British authorities in Gibraltar appointed Frederick Solly Flood as the investigator. Solly Flood was the Attorney General of Gibraltar, and he approached the case with deep suspicion. He believed there had been foul play, possibly murder, piracy, or insurance fraud. He was convinced that either the crew of the Mary Celeste had murdered Captain Briggs and his family, or that Morehouse's crew had somehow been involved in the disappearance. The Mary Celeste was thoroughly examined. Naval surveyors went over every inch of the ship. They were looking for evidence of violence, sabotage, or deception. What they found was almost nothing conclusive. Yes, there was a sword found in Captain Briggs's cabin. When tested, it appeared to have reddish-brown stains that might be blood. Solly Flood was certain this was evidence of murder, but when properly analyzed, the stains turned out to be rust, not blood. The sword had simply corroded. There were marks on the ship's rails that might have been made by an axe. Solly Flood theorized these were from a boarding attack, but they could just as easily have been normal wear and tear or damage from equipment. The most suspicious finding was the missing lifeboat and the cut ropes. This suggested the crew had abandoned ship quickly, possibly in panic. But abandoned ship for what reason? The ship was still seaworthy. It wasn't sinking. There was no fire, no storm damage, no signs of attack. The investigation interviewed the crew of the Dei Gratia extensively. Their stories remained consistent. They'd found the ship abandoned, exactly as they'd reported. There was no evidence they'd been involved in any criminal activity. Captain Morehouse's character was investigated. He was found to be reputable and honest. The idea that he would murder his friend and his friend's wife and child for salvage money was implausible. Besides, the salvage value, while significant, wasn't worth the risk of murder and piracy charges if caught. The investigators looked into Captain Briggs's background. Was he in financial trouble? Did he have enemies? Could he have staged his own disappearance? The answers were no, and extremely unlikely. Briggs was solvent, well-regarded, and had no motive to fake his own death, especially not if it meant abandoning his daughter and wife in the process, or worse, killing them. The cargo of alcohol was examined. Could it have exploded? Could the fumes have been dangerous? The barrels were inspected. 9 were found empty, but this was consistent with normal leakage over the course of a sea voyage. There was no evidence of an explosion or fire. The cargo holds showed no scorch marks or damage. After 3 months of investigation, Solly Flood reached a frustrating conclusion. He couldn't prove what happened. He suspected foul play, but he had no evidence. No bodies, no witnesses, no clear motive. The case, legally speaking, went nowhere. The court did award salvage rights to Captain Morehouse and his crew, but the amount was significantly reduced from what they'd hoped for, partly because Solly Flood's report cast suspicion on them, even though no charges were ever filed. The investigation in Gibraltar ended with more questions than answers. The Mary Celeste was released back to its owners. The ship was eventually repaired and returned to service, though it gained a reputation as an unlucky vessel, and sailors were reluctant to crew on her. She sailed for another 12 years before being deliberately wrecked in a failed insurance fraud scheme in 1885. But that's another story. As for the 10 people who vanished from the Mary Celeste on or around November 25, 1872, not one trace of them was ever found. No bodies washed ashore. No lifeboat wreckage. No survivors ever came forward. They simply disappeared. For 152 years, people have tried to explain what happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste. Dozens of theories have been proposed, ranging from the plausible to the fantastical. Let's examine the major ones. Theory 1. Alcohol fumes explosion. This is one of the most popular rational explanations. The Mary Celeste was carrying 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol. The theory suggests that alcohol fumes might have built up in the hold, creating a highly flammable and potentially explosive atmosphere. Here's the scenario. At some point, possibly when checking the cargo, one or more barrels leaked or burst. Alcohol fumes filled the hold. These fumes are colorless, but have a strong smell. If Captain Briggs went below to inspect the cargo and encountered these fumes, he might have feared an imminent explosion. Even if there was no actual explosion, the fear of one might have been enough. Remember, this cargo, if it exploded, would destroy the ship instantly and kill everyone aboard. If Briggs believed the ship was about to blow up, his only option would be to evacuate everyone immediately, get them off the ship, and wait at a safe distance to see if it exploded. The lifeboat could have been lowered in panic. The crew and Briggs' family would have abandoned ship, intending to wait safely away until they could determine if the ship was actually going to explode. If it didn't explode, they could return. But here's where the theory gets tragic. What if they got into the lifeboat, and then the rope connecting them to the Mary Celeste broke or was cut accidentally? The Mary Celeste, still under sail, would have drifted away faster than they could row the lifeboat. They would have been left stranded in the Atlantic in a small boat, miles from land, with limited supplies. This theory explains why the ship was abandoned while still seaworthy. It explains the missing lifeboat. It explains the apparent haste. And it explains why no trace was ever found. The lifeboat and its occupants would have perished at sea. Problems with this theory. There was no evidence of an explosion or fire aboard the ship. No scorch marks. No damaged barrels in a way that suggested explosion. And why wouldn't they have tethered the lifeboat more securely if they intended to return? Theory 2. Waterspout or sudden storm. A waterspout is essentially a tornado over water. They can appear suddenly and are terrifying to encounter in a sailing ship. The theory suggests a waterspout or sudden severe storm might have convinced Captain Briggs to evacuate. If a massive waterspout appeared near the ship, or if weather conditions suggested one was forming, Briggs might have believed the safest option was to get everyone into the lifeboat and away from the ship before it was caught and destroyed by the waterspout. This would explain the hasty abandonment. It would explain why the ship survived. Perhaps the waterspout missed the Mary Celeste, but caught the lifeboat. Or perhaps the lifeboat was lost in rough seas that followed. Problems. The last log entry showed no indication of severe weather. The ship's condition when found suggested it hadn't been through a major storm. And why not wait out a storm aboard the larger, more stable ship, rather than risk a small lifeboat? Theory 3. Piracy or mutiny. Solly Flood, the original investigator, favored this theory. Perhaps the crew mutinied, killed Captain Briggs and his family, then fled in the lifeboat with whatever they could steal. Or perhaps pirates attacked, took what they wanted, killed or captured the crew and passengers, and left the ship adrift. The problems with this theory are numerous. There was no evidence of violence aboard the ship. No blood, the sword stains were rust. No signs of struggle. The cargo was intact. If pirates attacked, why not take the valuable alcohol cargo? If the crew mutinied, where did they go? And why would experienced sailors choose to set off in a small lifeboat across the Atlantic, rather than sail the Mary Celeste to a port where they could disappear? Theory 4. Seaquake or underwater earthquake. Some researchers have proposed that an underwater earthquake or seaquake might have occurred near the ship. These can create bizarre effects: sudden water level changes, strange sounds, vibrations. If the crew felt what seemed like an earthquake beneath them, they might have feared the ship was breaking apart or about to sink. This could have caused a panicked evacuation. The ship might have sustained minor damage that made it seem like it was flooding or about to sink. Captain Briggs might have ordered everyone into the lifeboat as a precaution. Once in the lifeboat, if the rope broke, they would have been stranded while the Mary Celeste sailed on. Problems. There's no record of seismic activity in that area at that time. And again, this doesn't fully explain why they'd abandon a ship that was clearly not sinking. Theory 5. Contaminated food or water. Could the crew and passengers have been? Theory 5. Contaminated food or water. Could the crew and passengers have been poisoned or sickened by contaminated food or water? Could they have become delirious or irrational? This theory suggests that if everyone aboard became ill, perhaps from ergot poisoning, a fungus that can grow on grain and cause hallucinations and psychosis, or from contaminated water, they might have made irrational decisions, including abandoning the ship. Problems. There's no evidence of contamination. And even if everyone was hallucinating, would Captain Briggs really order his wife and 2-year-old daughter into a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic? That seems extreme even under the influence of hallucinogens. Theory 6. The missing barrels. A more recent theory. Modern researchers have proposed a refined version of the alcohol fumes theory. 9 barrels were found empty when the ship was discovered. What if these particular barrels were made of different wood than the others? Red oak instead of white oak. Red oak is more porous and could have allowed alcohol to seep out and create fumes. If these 9 barrels started leaking, the fumes could have built up below deck. When someone, probably Captain Briggs or the first mate, opened the main hatch to check on the cargo, there might have been a sudden whoomph sound as the fumes ignited but didn't quite explode. Just enough fire and smoke to be terrifying, but not enough to damage the ship significantly. This would have looked and sounded like the ship was about to blow up. Briggs would have ordered immediate evacuation. Everyone into the lifeboat. Get away from the ship fast. They would have taken the chronometer and navigation tools because they planned to return once they were sure the ship wasn't going to explode. But the Mary Celeste kept sailing. With its sails still set, it moved faster than the crew could row the lifeboat. Within minutes, the ship would have been out of reach. The lifeboat, with 10 people aboard, including a 2-year-old child, would have been alone in the Atlantic. Even good weather, they had limited supplies and no realistic chance of reaching land. This theory is compelling because it explains almost everything: the hasty departure, the missing navigation instruments, the relatively good condition of the ship, and why no trace was found of the crew. Theory 7. The fantastical theories. Over the years, less plausible theories have included sea monsters, alien abduction, time warps, and attacks by giant squid. These make for good stories, but have no evidence supporting them. The truth is, we simply don't know. After 152 years, the mystery of the Mary Celeste remains unsolved. Let's step back and look at what we can say with absolute certainty about the Mary Celeste. We know the ship left New York on November 7th, 1872, with 10 people aboard. We know it was found abandoned on December 4th, 1872, about 400 miles east of the Azores. We know the ship was seaworthy when found, in good enough condition that 3 men were able to sail it to Gibraltar. We know the lifeboat was missing, along with the chronometer, sextant, and ship's papers. We know there were no bodies, no blood, no signs of violence or struggle aboard. We know that 9 of the alcohol barrels were empty, but this could have been normal leakage. We know the last log entry was November 25th and showed no indication of problems. We know Captain Briggs was an experienced, careful sailor. We know his wife and young daughter were aboard. We know the crew were professional seamen, not criminals or troublemakers. And we know that not one of those 10 people was ever seen or heard from again. No bodies washed ashore in the months and years that followed. No survivor ever came forward. No wreckage of the lifeboat was ever found. The most likely explanation, based on the evidence, is probably some version of the alcohol fumes theory, that something scared Captain Briggs badly enough to evacuate the ship immediately, and that the crew and passengers perished at sea in the lifeboat when they couldn't get back to the ship. But we can't be certain, and that uncertainty is what makes the Mary Celeste one of the most enduring mysteries in maritime history. The ship itself sailed on after the incident, under different ownership, for another 12 years. Sailors considered it cursed, and it was difficult to find crews willing to sail on her. Finally, in 1885, the ship was deliberately run aground in Haiti as part of an insurance fraud scheme. The fraud was discovered, and the ship was left to rot. The Mary Celeste, the ghost ship that had sailed herself across the Atlantic, ended her days as a wreck in shallow Caribbean waters. But the mystery of what happened to Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their daughter Sophia, and the 7 crew members remains unsolved to this day. The story of the Mary Celeste has captured imaginations for over 150 years. It's been the subject of countless books, articles, documentaries, and fictional adaptations, and it's easy to see why. This isn't a mystery where we lack information. We know exactly who was aboard. We know when and where the ship was found. We have the physical evidence of the ship itself. We have detailed investigation records. And yet, we still can't definitively answer the simple question: what happened? The Mary Celeste represents one of those rare cases where all the evidence is available, all the facts are known, and the mystery still remains unsolved. It's a reminder that even in our modern age, with all our technology and forensic capabilities, there are still mysteries that resist explanation. 10 people stepped onto that ship in New York Harbor in November 1872. They were real people with names, families, lives, and futures. Captain Briggs had plans for his career. Sarah Briggs had written letters home talking about returning to her son. Little Sophia was just 2 years old. The crew had families waiting for them in various ports. And then they vanished. Somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, on or around November 25th, 1872, something happened that caused all 10 of them to leave the Mary Celeste and climb into a small lifeboat, and they were never seen again. The Mary Celeste sailed on without them, a ghost ship carrying their belongings, their half-prepared meals, their secrets. When she was found, she was still sailing herself, as if waiting for her crew to return. What do you think happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste? Was it alcohol fumes? A waterspout? Something else entirely? Share your theory in the comments below. If you're fascinated by maritime mysteries and unsolved historical cases, Subscribe to the Mystery Archives for more investigations into the events that still haunt us. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next mystery. If you enjoyed this deep dive, check out our previous videos on the Dyatlov Pass incident, the vanishing of Brian Schaffer, and the mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe. There's a whole playlist of unsolved mysteries waiting for you. The Mary Celeste remains one of the greatest mysteries of the sea, and perhaps that's exactly how she'll remain.